A racist biker attacked a pregnant woman in a wheelchair, not realizing Keanu Reeves was watching. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. It was a chilly evening in downtown Los Angeles, the kind where the air buzzed with a strange mix of calm and chaos. 32-year-old Sarah Miller, assumed to be Mother S in her wheelchair, waiting for her husband James to pick her up after her prenatal class. She had always been a fighter. Her paralysis was the result of a car accident 3 years ago, but it hadn't dimmed her spirit. Her world revolved around the little life growing inside her, and her smile radiated that love unbeknownst to her. Trouble was brewing across the street. A group of leather-clad bikers had parked their Harley outside a bar. Among them was Tony Briggs, a man infamous for his short temper and unapologetically bigoted views fueled by alcohol and misguided arrogance. Tony locked his eyes on Sarah. The sight of her wheelchair and her obvious vulnerability seemed to stoke some twisted fire in him. Tony sauntered across the street, his towering figure casting a shadow over Sarah. What are you doing out here, sweetheart? People like you don't belong in our streets, he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Sarah's heart raced. She clutched her belly protectively, hoping anyone would come to her aid. What neither Tony nor Sarah realized was that a man sitting quietly on a bench nearby had been observing the scene unfold. Keanu Reeves, the Hollywood star known for his kindness and humility, had been enjoying a rare moment of solitude after wrapping up a movie shoot. With his signature black leather jacket and beanie, he was almost unrecognizable, blending effortlessly into the crowd. Keanu's eyes narrowed as Tony's tone grew more aggressive. What's in the wheelchair? A charity case. Should have stayed home where you belong, Tony spat, stepping closer. Sarah, trying to stay calm for her baby's sake, whispered, please just leave me alone. Keanu couldn't take it anymore. Rising to his feet, he walked briskly toward them, but he wasn't the only one noticing the commotion. A small crowd began to gather there, murmurs building a tense atmosphere. Keanu approached, his expression a mixture of calm and controlled intensity. Hey, Keanu said, his voice even but firm. That's enough. Tony turned, his face contorting into a scowl. And who the hell are you? He barked. The crowd gasped as recognition dawned on some of their faces, but Keanu didn't play into the fame card. Instead, he said, someone who doesn't stand by while bullies pick on others walk away. Now Tony laughed, but it was hollow, almost nervous. Something about Keanu's steady gaze unsettled him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. What are you going to do, tough guy? Call the cops. Keanu stepped closer, his calm demeanor never wavering. No, he said quietly, but I won't let you hurt her. The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd watched, holding their breath. Sarah looked up at Keanu, tears glistening in her eyes, silently pleading for this nightmare to end. Just then, James arrived, running toward his wife after parking his car down the street. What's going on here? He demanded, his protective instincts kicking in. And at that moment, something shifted in Tony's posture. Maybe it was the crowd now fully against him, or the unyielding strength in Keanu's eyes. But before he could respond, another biker called out from across the street, Tony, leave it, man. Let's go. Tony hesitated, his bravado crumbling. With a grunt, he turned and stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. Keanu knelt down beside Sarah. Are you okay? He asked gently. Before Sarah could answer, James stepped forward. Thank you for stepping in. He extended a hand, his gratitude evident. Keanu shook it and said, she's strong, but nobody should have to go through that. The crowd began to disperse, but the buzz of what had just happened lingered in the air. Sarah, still shaken, managed a small smile. Thank you, she whispered, but This was far from over. Tony wasn't the kind to let humiliation slide, especially not in front of an audience. As Ku helped Sarah into James's car, a sense of foreboding hung in the air. Little did they know this encounter would lead to a series of events that none of them could have anticipated. As the car rolled away, Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped James's reassuring arm. Her husband glanced at her pale face, his eyes clouded with concern. "Sarah, are you okay? Did he touch you?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sarah shook her head slowly, whispering, "He didn't, but our baby, I was so scared." James gritted his teeth, anger flashing across his face. His wife, his heart, the woman he had promised to protect, had been cornered by a man who didn't care about her vulnerability. He silently vowed never to let anything like this happen again. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves stood under the glow of the street light, watching the car fade into the distance. The encounter lingered in his mind more than it should have. He was no stranger to darkness, but seeing such raw cruelty unfold in front of him left a mark. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the weight in his chest. The following morning, Sarah sat on the couch at home, her wheelchair parked beside her. She rested her hands on her round belly, gently rubbing it. "You're safe, little one," she murmured, but her mind kept flashing back to the night before, the way Tony's shadow loomed over her, the cutting words that made her feel so small. And then Keanu's voice, steady like a shield, breaking through her fear. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through headlines. She wasn't expecting to see what she did. Keanu Reeves intervenes to protect pregnant woman in wheelchair from assault. Her breath caught. The article recounted the incident, though it painted her as a nameless victim. Comment sections flooded with praise for Keanu's bravery, but also fury at the unnamed biker. Sarah's heart tightened. The world now knew a part of her story, but the pain behind it was hers alone too. There, at the same time, Keanu was sitting at a small cafe in Santa Monica, sipping black coffee, lost in thought. His assistant had texted him the articles and social media reactions, but for him, it wasn't about the spotlight. It never was. That woman, she haunted him. He couldn't forget her fear, or the way she clutched her stomach as though shielding her unborn child from the world's cruelty. Hours passed and Keanu decided to act. He contacted a local women's advocacy group, discreetly offering to cover medical expenses or security measures for the woman he had helped. He didn't know her name, but he wanted her to feel safe. Across town, Tony sat in a dingy apartment, fuming. His biker friends had been teasing him mercilessly about being put in his place by a Hollywood pretty boy. Each taunt felt like a wound to his pride. He paced the room, his mind simmering with thoughts of revenge. He wasn't going to let it go, not this time. Meanwhile, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A delivery man stood at her door, holding a small envelope. Confused, she opened it and found a handwritten note. "Dear Sarah, I hope you and your baby are doing well. You are incredibly brave, and I'm sorry you had to face such cruelty. Please know that there are people in this world who care deeply about your safety and happiness. If there's anything you need, you can always reach out to me through the contact information enclosed. With love and respect." Keanu Reeves' tears spilled down her cheeks as she read the note. It wasn't just the words, it was the gesture, the thoughtfulness behind them. For a moment she felt less alone, like someone truly saw her. But the storm brewing in the background was far from over. One evening, James came home with a grim expression. "There's been news about that biker," he said cautiously. "He's been seen hanging around your prenatal center. He's looking for trouble." Sarah's heart sank, fear curling in her chest. "Why can't he just leave us alone?" she whispered. James immediately called the authorities, filing a report, but they both knew it might not be enough. That night, Sarah sat awake by the window, her hand resting on her stomach, silently praying for her child's future. Keanu, unaware of this new development, was on set distracted during filming. His co-star, who had heard about the incident, gently nudged him. "You okay, man? You seem off." Keanu nodded faintly, just thinking about someone, he said, his voice heavy with concern. What none of them knew was that their lives were about to intertwine in ways none of them could predict. Tony's thirst for revenge, Sarah's fight for her family, and Keanu's unwavering kindness would set off a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. Late that night, Sarah sat in her living room, the dim light of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Her hands rested protectively on her belly as she hummed a lullaby, her voice soft and trembling. The weight of the recent events pressed down on her, but she tried to find peace in the thought of her baby. James, ever watchful, sat nearby, scanning the front yard through the curtains. His knuckles were white as he gripped his phone, ready to call the police at the slightest sign of trouble unknown to them outside. In the shadows, Tony leaned against his motorcycle, staring at their home from a distance. His expression was a mixture of anger and desperation. To him, this wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It was about reclaiming the power he felt slipping away. The faint glow of a cigarette lit up his face as he muttered to himself, "No one makes a fool out of me." Miles away, Keanu sat in his sleek but understated apartment, unable to sleep. The woman in the wheelchair, Sarah, her face wouldn't leave his mind. He wondered if she was okay, if she felt safe. Something about her vulnerability reminded him of his younger sister Kim, who had battled leukemia when they were teenagers. He remembered holding her hand during her weakest moments, promising to protect her from a world that didn't always understand her struggles. The thought of failing to protect Sarah haunted him. The next morning, Sarah woke to a surprise. On her doorstep was a small box with no return address. Inside, she found a custom baby blanket, beautifully embroidered with the words "Strength is in love." Her fingers traced the soft fabric as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't need a signature to know who had sent it that day. James insisted on driving her to her prenatal appointment, unwilling to let her go alone. As they pulled into the clinic parking lot, James noticed a familiar motorcycle parked across the street. His stomach sank. "Stay in the car," he said firmly, stepping out to confront Tony. Tony smirked as James approached, his stance casual but menacing. "What do you want, Briggs? Haven't you done enough?" James demanded, his voice steady but strained. Tony flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his boot. "Just wanted to say hi," he said mockingly. "You know, see how the whiz doing before the situation could escalate." A sleek black car pulled into the parking lot. To James's astonishment, Keanu stepped out, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He'd been on his way to a meeting when something compelled him to stop by the clinic, and now he realized why. "Is there a problem here?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but authoritative. His gaze locked onto Tony, who immediately stiffened. Tony's bravado faltered. "You again? What? You following me now?" he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Keanu stepped closer, his tone firm. "I'm here to make sure she's safe. Whatever grudge you think you have, it ends now." Tony took a step back, glancing nervously at James and Keanu. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his reign of intimidation was slipping through his fingers. With a growl of frustration, he turned and mounted his bike, revving the engine loudly before speeding away. Sarah, watching from the car, let out a shaky breath of relief. James and Keanu walked back together, their expressions serious. "Thank you," James said, his voice filled with gratitude. Keanu nodded. "I wasn't going to let him hurt her, are you?" As they entered the clinic, Sarah looked at Keanu with a mixture of awe and Emotion, you didn't have to do this, she said softly. Keanu gave her a small smile. Some things are worth stepping up for. But just when they thought the danger had passed, the story took another turn. That evening Sarah received a letter. Slid under her door. The handwriting was messy, the words chilling. This isn't over. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the note. James immediately called the police, his voice trembling with frustration and fear as they waited for the authorities to arrive. Sarah sat silently, her thoughts racing. Keanu, still in his hotel room, received a call from James. The first. Don't know what else to do, James admitted, his voice cracking. He won't stop. I'm scared from my wife for our child. Without hesitation, Keanu replied, I'll handle it. What followed would be a series of unexpected events, a chain reaction of courage, kindness, and heartbreak that would leave everyone changed forever. That night, rain drummed softly against the windows of Sarah and James's modest home. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken fear. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, the crumpled letter clenched in her trembling hand. James stood by the window, his eyes scanning the driveway for any sign of movement. He hadn't told Sarah, but he hadn't slept in days. His mind was consumed with keeping her in their unborn child safe. As the rain fell harder, a faint knock echoed through the house. Both of them froze. James grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door. Sarah, despite her condition, wheeled herself closer to him, unwilling to be left alone. Who's there? James called out, his voice tight. It's me, a familiar voice answered Keanu. James opened the door to find Keanu standing there, soaked to the bone. His face was calm but resolute. I couldn't leave you to deal with this alone, he said simply, stepping inside. James opened the door to find Keanu standing there, soaked to the bone. His face was calm but resolute. I couldn't leave you to deal with this alone, he said simply, stepping inside. For the next hour, the three of them sat together in the living room. Keanu listened intently as James explained the letter, Tony's continued harassment, and their growing fear for the safety of their child. Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke, tears streaming down her face. I just want my baby to come into a world where they feel safe. Is that too much to ask? Keanu's jaw tightened. He didn't respond immediately, but his silence spoke volumes. Finally he said, I've dealt with people like Tony before. They thrive on fear, but we're going to make sure he doesn't get the chance to hurt you again. James raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? Keanu leaned forward, his eyes steady. We document everything, the notes, the encounters, everything he's done. Then we involve people who can help law enforcement, the media if necessary. People like him don't want attention on their actions. As Keanu spoke, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. He wasn't just a famous actor, he was a man willing to use his resources to protect a family he barely knew. But even as they planned, Tony was unraveling at a dimly lit bar across town. He sat nursing a drink, his mind spiraling. His so-called friends had abandoned him, mocking him for being humiliated not once but twice. He was alone now, and the bitterness in his heart turned to something darker. The next morning, Keanu arranged for a security system to be installed at Sarah and James's home. He stayed with them while the technicians worked, his presence a source of reassurance. By the afternoon, local authorities were finally taking their complaints seriously. An officer visited their home, promising to increase patrols in the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to exhale. That evening, Keanu stayed for dinner. They shared stories, laughter even finding its way into their heavy hearts. Sarah learned about Keanu's sister, about the quiet battles he had fought in his life, and about the profound compassion that shaped him. But just as the night seemed to offer a rare moment of peace, the phone rang. James answered, and his face turned pale as he listened. What do you mean he's out on bail? He whispered, his voice shaking. Sarah's heart sank. Tony had been arrested earlier that day after a neighbor reported him lurking near their home. They thought it was over now. The fear crept back stronger than before. Keanu, sensing the shift in the room, stood. We're not backing down, he said firmly. He doesn't control this story, you do. But even Keanu couldn't have predicted what would happen next. That same night a fire broke out at Sarah and James's home. Flames consumed the back porch, sending thick smoke billowing into the sky. The couple woke to the piercing sound of the alarm Keanu had installed just hours before. James carried Sarah out in his arms as neighbors gathered, shouting and calling 911 as they stood shivering in the street watching their home burn. Sarah clung to James, sobbing, why won't he just stop? Keanu arrived minutes later, having received a frantic call from James. When he saw the devastation, something inside him snapped. He approached the fire chief, offering to cover every expense to rebuild the home. But in his heart he knew it wasn't enough. Tony had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about protecting an innocent family from a man who had nothing left to lose. As dawn broke, Keanu made a phone call, not to the police, not to his assistant, but to someone he trusted implicitly, a private INV investigator known for handling dangerous cases. I need you to find everything you can on Tony Briggs, he said, and I mean everything. Sarah and James were relocated to a safe house arranged by Keanu as they settled into their temporary shelter. Sarah looked at Keanu, her voice trembling with gratitude. You've done so much for us. Why you don't even know us? Keanu smiled faintly, his eyes kind but serious. Because no one should go through this alone, and because I know what it's like to feel powerless. You're not powerless anymore. Little did they know Tony wasn't done, and the days ahead would test the strength, love, and resilience of everyone involved in ways they could never have imagined. The safe house was quiet, nestled in a secluded neighborhood far from the chaos that had consumed Sarah and James's lives. The couple tried to adjust, but the lingering sense of danger made sleep difficult. Sarah often found herself awake at odd hours, her hand resting on her belly, whispering soft reassurances to her unborn child. Keanu visited daily, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting with them sharing stories. Keanu visited daily, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting with them sharing stories to lighten the mood. He became more than a protector, he became family. His presence was a source of calm amidst the storm. But even as they rebuilt their sense of security, Tony's shadow loomed. The private investigator Keanu had hired uncovered unsettling details. Tony had a history of violence, restraining orders from previous altercations, and deep-seated anger issues. Keanu shared the findings with the authorities, pushing them to take stronger action. But Tony remained elusive, slipping through cracks in the system. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows, Sarah felt a sharp pain ripple through her body. Her breath hitched and she clutched her stomach. James, she called weakly, her voice trembling. James rushed to her side, his heart pounding. It's too soon, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Keanu, who had been in the kitchen, immediately sprang into action. We're taking you to the hospital, he said, his voice steady but urgent. The drive was tense, every second stretching into an eternity. When they arrived, Sarah was rushed into the maternity ward. James stayed by her side, holding her hand tightly. Keanu paced in the waiting room, his mind racing. He knew how fragile life could be, how quickly joy could turn to sorrow. Hours passed. Finally a nurse emerged, her face kind but serious. The baby is stable, she said, but it was a complicated delivery. Sarah needs to rest. James was allowed to see his wife and Keanu followed shortly after, hesitant, but wanting to be there for them. When he entered the room, Sarah was holding a tiny bundle in her arms. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him. Keanu, she said softly, meet Hope. The baby was small, her face peaceful as she slept. Hope? Keanu asked, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, because that's what you gave us when everything felt lost. You reminded us to hold on. Keanu swallowed hard, his usual composure faltering. He reached out, gently touching the baby's hand. She's beautiful, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but the peace was short-lived. A police officer entered the room, his expression grim. We have news about Tony Briggs, he said. Hune's been spotted near the hospital. James stiffened, his protective instincts flaring. What does he want? Why can't he leave us alone? The officer glanced at Keanu. We're not sure, but we've increased security around the hospital. We'll ensure your family is safe. Keanu didn't wait for further explanation. He stepped outside, his jaw set. He wasn't going to let Tony get near Sarah, James, or baby Hope. Later that night, as Sarah and James rested, Keanu kept watch in the hallway. Hours passed in silence, but his instincts remained sharp. Then, just before dawn, he saw a figure lurking near the stairwell. It was Tony. Keanu approached quietly, his movements deliberate. You need to leave, he said, his voice low but firm. Tony turned, his face twisted with rage. You think you can stop me? You don't know who you're dealing with. I know exactly who you are, Keanu replied, and I know you're scared. That's why you're doing this, because you don't know how to face yourself. Tony lunged, but Keanu was faster. With controlled precision, he restrained Tony, pinning him against the wall until hospital security arrived. The police were called, and this time they had enough evidence to ensure Tony wouldn't escape justice. As Tony was led away in handcuffs, Keanu exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with relief. The ordeal was finally over. In the weeks that followed, life began to stabilize. For Sarah and James, they returned home with Hope, rebuilding their lives one day at a time. Keanu remained a constant presence, visiting often, his bond with the family growing stronger. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in the backyard watching Hope sleep in her crib, Sarah turned to Keanu. We'll never be able to thank you enough, she said, her voice full of emotion. Keanu smiled, his gaze soft. You don't have to thank me. Seeing you all safe and happy is enough. As he held baby Hope in his arms, a rare tear slid down his cheek. For all the heartbreak and challenges they had faced, this moment was a reminder of what truly mattered: love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond that formed in the most unlikely circumstances. And though their journey had been filled with pain, it had also brought them together in a way none of them could have imagined. Together they had found hope, not just in the tiny miracles sleeping soundly, but in each other. The story ended not with fear, but with healing, with new beginnings, and with a promise that no matter what the world threw at them, they would face it together.